Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. We will just give it 30 more seconds to allow people to join, and then we will get started with today's session. It is good to see so many people coming on to the call. As always, you've been through the drill a couple of times by now, but we would really like you to change your name in Zoom to make sure that we have your name and your organization. That will make it much easier for us to organize the breakout rooms later in the session. So please follow the instructions on the screen and change your name in Zoom to let us know your name and your organization. All right. Once again, a very warm welcome to this session on net zero targets. We've been really excited about this one. I believe we are the only networks organizing this session in connection with Climate Ambition Accelerator. So this session actually is not part of the official program, but we thought it would be very interesting and helpful for all of you to go through the current requirements for setting net zero targets, and also many of the discussions about how to reach long-term targets, and obviously also going through some of the transition plans you need to have in place in order to reach the targets. And so today, as with the previous SBTI focus session, we will have 21 Holistic with us today. It's Fernanda and Paula from who's up very early to help us out in their time zone. So we're very happy about that. As always, this is the Nordic team. You know us, hopefully all of you by now. If you have any questions about the program, any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can see our emails and phone numbers on the slide. With the advanced track, it is Thomas and myself who are sort of the main contacts for the advanced track, and for the foundations, it's Carolina and Albert. So this is the agenda today. You've had the opportunity to post to pre-submit some questions for Fernanda and Paula, which we will go through after a break. But before then, we will go through some net zero focused themes. So Paula will be talking about preparation, approval, and transition planning when it comes to net zero. If you have any questions during the session, we would just like to remind you, please use the Q&A function. We want this session to be very engaging, so please don't hold back. Ask the questions, and then we will have plenty of time to discuss. After we go through your pre-submitted questions, we will go into breakout rooms. We have some questions for you to discuss in terms of the preparedness for net zero and the main barriers to setting net zero targets and so on. And then finally, we will go through next steps. As always, some housekeeping rules. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. We would also very much like to see your faces. It makes these sessions much more engaging. And when you are in the breakout rooms, and if there are more of you, please nominate a spokesperson so every company has a chance to get their voices heard. And then finally, as always, we operate under the Chatham House rule in these breakout rooms, which also means that you can discuss anything you like, but you can't refer to these discussions to any specific companies or persons. You can ascribe anything to a specific person or a company. That's what the Chatham House rule is all about. And just a final reminder before I pass on the word to Paula and Fernanda. please do change your name. In Zoom, we want your name and your organization, and that will allow us to allocate you into breakout rooms later on. And I think that might be it. No, I also we have this slide. We are coming very, very close to the end of this of the program. I think what we're missing on this slide, and it might be my mistake, is the last wrap-up session that we will have in November. And we really encourage you to participate in that one. We will have a presentation about the connection between the SBTI and new EU legislation, so CSRD and also CSDDD, which is coming up. So that's going to be a very exciting session. Today's theme is SBTI Net Zero. Many of you attended the near-term session, so I won't go much into this. I just want to point out some corrections we have to the SBTI online modules. 3 important corrections. It has to do with the new SME criteria. There were some mistakes. There are other criteria put into force now, which was effective from January of this year. And I just, if anybody needs to dive into that, we encourage you to go through the FAQ for SMEs, going through the new criteria. And then we also encourage you to always look at the SBTI's website for new sector guidance. That is the most updated. If you see some old slides, they might be, well, they might be outdated tomorrow already because things are going so fast. And then finally, any resources that has to do with SBTI, always consult the SBTI's website. They have the most updated versions. All right, that's it for me. I'm super excited to pass the word on to 21 Holistic and Paula and Fernanda.
Thank you so much, Joachim, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's early, but always encouraging to talk to companies that, are looking to increase their climate ambition. I mean, we really need it. It's been scary the past couple of days with all the hurricanes and passing from category 1 to 5, so I hope that you are already are sensible to these topics, and that you're looking for answers on how to take action. So hopefully this session will help you in that journey. And so I just wanted to start with that note. So thank you so much for the invitation. We will start with a few recap slides. I promise that I'll go very quick because I know that you probably have already studied the main concepts of net zero as per SBTI's standard. But I think it's great to set the ground first to be able to then enter into more detailed discussions. So if we move to the next slide, please. So we have 4 sections in this slide deck. We'll first deep dive into the key concepts of net zero targets. Then we will talk about the validation process and requirements in the SBTI. We'll also talk about transition plans and monitoring, reporting, and verification. And finally, we will talk about the major revision that SBTI is conducting to its net zero standard. So let's get to it. So if we start with the topic number 1, so the deep dive, let's recap on what net zero means. So if we move to the next slide. Thank you. So the current state of greenhouse gas emissions is that they are, really higher than they need to be. We are accumulating greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's what is causing an enhanced global warming effect, right? So what we know is that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we must reach net zero emissions by no later than 2050. And this is basically the results of the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees that was released back in 2018, right? So we really need to get to this goal, and it has to be also with little to no overshoot if we want to have a likely chance to achieve this goal. So that's why SBTI started developing the net zero standard back in 2018 after the release of the IPCC special report. And in 2020, it released the first version of the corporate net zero standard. If we move to the next slide, please. So basically, the current state is that the net amount of greenhouse gas emissions is more than 55 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And if we move to the next one, the goal is to reach a net amount of greenhouse gas emissions that is 0 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, right? So this is what the IPCC defines as net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So it's the condition in which the metric weighted anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by a metric weighted anthropogenic greenhouse gas removals over a specific period, right? So this is this balance that we're trying to reach at the global level. So what else do we know about net zero? If we move to the next slide, we know that it's achievable and that we need 4 main elements. The first one is to truly decarbonize our energy supply system. So full or near full decarbonization for energy and industrial CO2 emissions by mid-century. Next one, please. We also need to work on the land and agriculture systems to also eliminate CO2 emissions associated with these activities, including also forestry. The third element is really, it's probably not going to reach a full elimination of non-CO2 emissions, but a deep cut of these emissions is necessary from all sectors, including land and agriculture as well. And finally, the last stage is to ensure that we remove CO2 from the atmosphere to neutralize any anthropogenic greenhouse gas residual emissions, and potentially also sustain net negative emissions thereafter, right after 2050, so that we can reduce the cumulative CO2 emissions in the atmosphere over time. So those are the 4 elements. And if we move to the next slide, please. So now let's talk about setting near-term versus long-term targets. So the first standard that SBTI developed was a corporate near-term target setting standard, right? And those are targets that run 5 to 10 years into the future. At the beginning, SBTI's ambition was 2 degrees Celsius, because that was where the world was in 2014 or 2015. But then after it released its net zero standard, it revamped the ambition, or the minimum ambition, for scope 1 and 2 targets to 1.5 degrees. So that's really the trajectory that we need to follow to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And if we move to the next slide, please, the next step is to set long-term targets, right? That's part of a net zero commitment. If your company is going to commit to net zero, you need to set near-term targets and long-term targets. And these long-term targets are deep decarbonization targets that will lead your company to a residual emissions level. Usually this is around a 90% cut of emissions, and we'll talk about it in the next slides. But this is, as a reminder, this is a compulsory step when you're aiming to align to net zero. So if we move to the next one, please. A third element that is not compulsory is a beyond value chain mitigation, and we can talk more about it if you have questions about this. But basically, in a nutshell, this is all the projects or financing or activities that companies can make outside its value chain, a company's value chain, so to help transition to net zero quicker, right? And to ensure that we don't lock in carbon intensive technologies, for instance. So this means helping others decarbonize. You can choose, for example, doing financing or purchasing high quality jurisdictional REDD+ credits or investing in direct air capture technologies. But there are many other options. Now, the new SBTi guidance on beyond value chain mitigation offers really an array of activities that companies can do, including also policy advocacy, for instance, that is very important in certain geographies. So if we move to the next element, the last one is to neutralize the residual emissions, right? So once you have achieved your long-term target, what is left is to ensure that any residual emissions are neutralized with an equivalent amount of CO2 removals and permanent storage, and that will have to happen thereafter, right? So if you continue to have these residual emissions after, at the latest 2050, then you'll need to neutralize those emissions. And we'll talk more about neutralization in this session. So maybe let's move on to the emission reduction cuts. So under the net zero standard, most companies need to reduce at least 50%, 90% to reach net zero. So how was this calculated? The first thing that the SBTi says is that evidence to show that we can near fully decarbonize the economy by 2050. If done correctly, it is the best way to meet our climate and sustainability goals, right? So this is taken from the IPCC assessment reports, and where they analyze different scenarios, including low demand scenarios that are the most compatible with sustainable development. Right, so we know that's possible. It's demonstrated in the long chapters of the IPCC report. If we move to the next slide, please. So the 90% reduction shows companies what's needed to align with net zero at the global level, even if CO2 removal proves to be more challenging than we expect, right? So there's kind of a buffer integrated in this 90% reduction threshold to account for that potential scenario, right? The next one is just a reminder that the SBTi has used as the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario, as one of the most important sources. SBTi uses IEA scenarios for many of its sectoral guidance. However, it was not the only source consulted. During the development of the net zero standard, really many other research was consulted, and if you were not aware of it, they do have a scientific advisory group that helps SBTi in developing these thresholds, right, that companies can use. Great. So if we move to the next section, we will talk quickly about the differences between long-term and near-term targets, but you probably already know this. This is just a quick recap. But long-term targets should be no later than 2050. They can be earlier for sure. And for two sectors, it's compulsory that net zero is reached earlier. So those are the power generation sector and the maritime sector. Now, with respect to ambition, in the short term, Scope 3 ambition is still flexible, and you can align your Scope 3 targets with well below 2 degrees, but then in the long term, for your long-term target as part of your net zero commitment, then you will have to also reduce Scope 3 emissions in line with 1.5 degree scenarios. Great. So with respect to the boundary, also there's a an increase in the coverage of Scope 3 emissions for the long-term target. It goes from 67% minimum coverage in near-term targets, and it has to move to 90% coverage of Scope 3 emissions in the long term. And finally, with respect to the methods, there are only some slight differences with respect to the type of eligible methods. The first one is that supplier engagement or customer engagement targets are only allowed for near-term targets and not for long-term targets. So basically, we need to really start engaging our suppliers ASAP. And the other difference is that in the short term, it's mainly all the sector scenarios that are, or sector pathways that are available. They're mainly an intensity convergence approach. In the long term, you have the option of setting sector targets using the intensity convergence approach, but also, or intensity contraction approach, actually, and also the absolute approach using the sector budget. So you will see those differences if you explore the Net Zero tool. You can see all the eligible methods that you can play with to set your long-term targets.
And Paula, just to have a quick question from for me. What is the most common methods used for setting net zero targets among the companies today, if you know that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I don't know if there's anything about that in the SBTi monitoring report. I would definitely look there because I know that they do have a breakdown of the most popular Scope 3 targets in the short term. And I think most of the companies are using absolute contraction. But for the long-term targets, I guess most, at least what I have seen, is a absolute reduction as well. But we would need to double check that. And I think the best place to look at is the SBTi monitoring report. So yeah, we can come back to that one. But just as a reminder, it's a good question because you can actually use different methods for also calculating your long-term targets, right? So you could, if you see the Net Zero tool, which helps you model your long-term targets, you can actually select first the boundary that you want to model. So maybe Scope 1 only, Scope 2, or Scope 1 and 2, or Scope 1, 2, and 3. And then you can choose a method, and actually you can have like a number of targets with different scope coverage. So that's a good question. We can come back to it after the session.
Great, and we will also come back to Tim's question about transitioning from a well below 2-degree target to 1.5 and from its 67% to 90% boundary. That's also an interesting question. Please keep the questions coming in the Q&A, and we will get to them all, hopefully.
Yeah, perfect. We do have that covered, I think, on the slide. So yeah, let's move on. So just this slide is just to remind us that SBTi has tried to really define the concepts of abatement and compensation when looking at the value chain of a company. So when within the value chain of a company, that would be called abatement. Any mitigation occurring outside the value chain of the company would be called compensation. And the key thing here is that when SBTi was developing the net zero standard, there was a discussion of whether neutralization should occur also within the value chain of a company. And it ended up being actually across, like basically you can, once you get there and start decarbonizing, but also neutralizing your residual emissions, that can come from, for example, credits that are associated to carbon removals, and they do not have to be necessarily in your value chain. They can also be outside of your value chain. So I just wanted to remind us about that. And now we can move a little bit more into the definition of the neutralization of residual emissions. So as I mentioned before, the greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere when the company has achieved its long-term science-based target must be counterbalanced through the permanent removal and storage of carbon from the atmosphere. So if we move to the next slide, please. Let's talk about the greenhouse gas protocol. There is a draft land and removals guidance that is planning to be finalized next year. And however, the SBTi already recommends companies to start using that protocol. And there, the definition of CO2 removals, it's where CO2 is transferred from the atmosphere to storage within a non-atmospheric carbon pool. So a CO2 removal can also be referred as carbon sequestration or enhanced carbon storage, where the carbon is derived from atmospheric CO2. So just to also to indicate that you can use these terms interchangeably. Great, so I highlighted a few words there. Let's move on to the next slide. These are important because it's also all about permanence, right? About really keeping that carbon stored in these other pools that are different from the atmosphere. And what the GHG protocol says about removals accounting requirements is that companies, this is optional, removals, it's optional reporting, but if accounted for, companies shall separately account for and report removals based on their sink process. So it could be a biogenic process, or it could be technological sinks. And it also have to be separated by storage pool. So, for example, if the sink is and the pool is a land-based storage or a product storage or geological storage. So now there's much more guidance of how companies should be reporting on these removals. And if we move to the next slide, please. Great. And so also, the GHG protocol says that accounting for Scope 1 and 2 removals and Scope 3 removals based on annual net carbon stock changes occurring in the reporting year using the stock change accounting method. So just to remind us about the stock change accounting method, that there are two methods to account for these removals. The other one is the flow accounting method, the GHG flow by sink process. So the difference is that really the stock change method, it looks at the carbon pool and the changes in carbon that occur in that given carbon pool. For example, like a product or as it says here in land-based or geological. While the flow process, it's really taking into account the gross fluxes of emissions and removals. So there are benefits and downsides to each, but the GHG protocol is asking for companies to use the net stock accounting. Now, if we move to the next one, please. So with respect to requirements, when you are calculating removals, you need to account for reversals accounting in the year that the losses occur. If that happens, that's very common with land-based projects. Also, you need to provide uncertainty estimates for removals. And actually, the GHG protocol for land and removals accounting introduced a new principle to make sure that you don't are overestimating or underestimating your removals, especially because it's hard accounting compared to GHG emissions. Also to use primary data specific to the sinks and the pools where carbon is stored. You also have to ensure traceability through the full CO2 removals pathway. And also you have to conduct ongoing storage and monitoring of the relevant carbon pools. So as you can see, it's becoming harder and just because of that issue of permanence of CO2 removals and storage.
And
Great.
Paula,
So
in terms of the uncertainty, sorry to jump in, but are there any standards in terms of assessing uncertainty that you can make use of? Is there, how would a company go about that?
yeah, so I'm pretty sure that that's in the GHG protocol land and removals guidance. I'm just not too familiar with it. I mean, it's a heavy guide, but I'm pretty sure that
Which is
one
not released yet, right?
it's in the draft form. So I have read the draft form, and
Mm,
it's a heavy document. So we can check and see if there's any chapter specific to calculating our uncertainty.
mm.
Sure there is in, for example, the scope 3 guidance. So I think that probably there's also a chapter more towards the end of the guidance about uncertainty calculations.
And it's sort of an interesting time with the land sector. The land sector guidance is not out yet from the greenhouse gas protocol. The net zero corporate standards is also being evaluated and reassessed and all of those things. So there is a little bit of uncertainty these days. How would you? So it's a matter of keeping updated. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a bit messy at the beginning. It's right because of course um, companies need this guidance to and they need to create the or acquire the capacity on like these new topics of removals accounting, for example. What the SBTI is saying is, to the best of your knowledge, use this draft guidance. And once it's final,
Mm,
SBTI will provide more guidance on how companies should really embrace it in their flag targets, for instance.
yes.
Uh, and so looking forward to it, right? So probably SBTI will still give a grace period for companies to make any adjustments that are necessary. They always do. So, but I would just say just get started because I have heard from many companies, and maybe here you can tell me as well that it really takes some time to get the grasp of it and really get started with removals accounting. So,
Mm,
yeah. We'll also talk more about or I can mention it now, like, but basically SBTI recommends companies to not wait until you have reached your net zero target or your long-term target to start neutralizing, right? Like it says
mm,
that companies should really try to start earlier and disclose their efforts to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that will also help companies to gain the knowledge that they need and also the credibility, right? So that's
mm.
yeah. So if you're already starting with your CO2 removal strategy, I would say this is the best time to learn and also make mistakes, right? So we have to have it right in 2050 and thereafter.
That's an excellent tip, Paula. Get started now if you've already are setting in the process of setting net zero targets. We have a question from an anonymous participant that is asking: is neutralizing similar to carbon offsetting? If not, what is the difference? So maybe Paula, you already explained it a bit, but could you put a few more words about it? It's also a matter of which terms to use and which terms the SBTI uses compared to other institutions.
Yeah, and actually there's a new resource that SBTI has released this year. It's a glossary in case that you have questions about the definitions used by SBTI. So I would really
Mhm.
recommend you to use that. But if the just to make sure I understood the question, so that the question is, what is the difference between removals and offsetting?
Neutralization and carbon offsetting. I think there's a bit of confusion in terms of what one term covers and what the other one covers because there's a similar activity. It's
Okay.
just yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can go back to that slide with the table, Fernanda, with where yeah, a couple of slides back. Sorry, going in reverse. But just to start responding the question, so neutralization is really about those residual emissions that will remain when you have achieved your long-term target, right? So those, you know, end of the tail emissions that are harder to evade, either because there's no technology or because it's too costly to reduce or eliminate. So
Mm.
those residual emissions are the ones that have to be neutralized with an equivalent amount of CO2 removals, right? Because they will exert the opposite force, right? If you're still emitting a ton of CO2 and if you're removing a ton of CO2, then the sum will be zero, right? So neutralization is about that. So now compensation, as you can see here on the slide, is what can occur outside of a company's value chain, right? So those are measures that companies take to prevent, reduce, or eliminate sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's also another difference, that compensation may not only cover removals, carbon removals, but it also may cover avoiding emissions and reducing emissions. And neutralization really has to be only removals, right? To exert the opposite force. So I hope
Yeah.
that answers your question, but it's
I,
tricky.
I, I think it does answer the question. Thank you, Paula. It's also a bit, always a bit of confusion, and also in terms of what the terms actually cover. I think this is a very, very good figure. And as you mentioned before, the SBTI doesn't operate with the term offsetting, but it would be in some cases synonymous to compensation. But with the stages you went through, or the different steps in the and recommendations in the net zero standard, they operate with the neutralization and then the beyond value chain mitigation. You will, I assume you will put a few words on that on BVCM later.
Yeah. Actually, if you have more questions about beyond value chain mitigation, let me know, because I ended up skipping those those slides.
I actually think we also discussed that we might not have time for this session. If we had a 4-hour session, we would have time to dive very much into that, but we don't want to exhaust everyone. So maybe, yeah.
Thank you for the questions. Please keep them coming. Maybe in the interest of time, we can start in section number 2. I just had a few other slides that you will anyways get the slides with additional information about CDR, and how much we will need. And CDR is carbon dioxide removal. There are some good papers that we consulted from BCG, so I'll skip those, but you'll have that information. But let's jump into the validation process and requirements. So if we move to the next slide, please. So there are a few resources that you will need to consider when you are developing your long-term targets and your net zero targets. It's the Getting Started guide. They have a very good diagram of kind of like a questionnaire for you to answer and then determine if you are ready to set net zero targets. Then there is of course, the SBTI corporate net zero standard, the corporate net zero tool, and then also the SBTI corporate target submission form, where you can see all what you will be asked with respect to your long-term targets. So if we move to the next one, please. So companies must have set near-term targets before setting net zero targets, or even they can set them both at the same time. But really, you do need to have a near-term target. You cannot only have a long-term target if you're aiming to become net zero. So before beginning the validation process, the company must assess the following criteria. So the first one is to make sure that your current near-term target are aligned with the latest corporate standard for near-term targets. Also, scope 1 and 2 near-term targets align with 1.5 degrees, and the scope 3 targets can still align with at least well below 2 degrees in the short term. Also, you have to ensure there's consistency with the latest SBTi criteria in case your near-term targets were validated 5 years ago. So if your near-term targets were validated before 2020, you really need to do resubmission. There hasn't been significant changes that would trigger a base year recalculation or target recalculation. So you have to make sure that hasn't happened. But if any of this is not true, then you do need to resubmit your targets. So if you move to the next slide, please. There you go. So you will need to resubmit your near-term targets for validation, and there's a special form for that. There's the SBTi Corporate Target Submission Form. Great. So with respect to timing, just quickly, let's go over base year, target year, reporting, etc. So the base year should be no earlier than 2050 for your long-term targets, and it should be the same year that you use for your near-term targets. So, and also scope 1 and 2 need to have the same base year for your long-term target, but scope 3 can be different. Next one, please. Once you have established your target, your long-term target, you also have to report publicly, as you do for your near-term targets, on the progress and reporting. Of course, in the beginning, it's just your year-on-year progress. And also, as you can see here, it is recommended that companies disclose any neutralization milestones before reaching your long-term target. Next one, please. And finally, the target year should be no later than 2050. You need to use an earlier target year for the power generation sector and the maritime sector. However, remember that this is something that the company needs to really understand when they can reach that net zero state, because the earlier the better, right? So if you see actually the net zero targets that have been established, they vary mainly on the target year, and some of them are earlier, as early as 2035. I think I've seen some, but mostly 2040, 2030, 2045, etc. Okay, great. So I think that was just on the criteria, general criteria. I just want to emphasize that there's also sector-specific criteria that is important for long-term targets, and some sectors do have that long-term criteria, like the aviation, maritime, and steel sectors. And that's why when you see the net zero tool, you'll find those pathways available. And it's important to consider them because they take into account the industry growth factor. They also take into account sectoral segmentation, for example, in the case of aviation for the short haul and the long haul trips, or passenger versus freight transportation. And they also sometimes include some specific sectoral requirements. So for example, for the maritime sector, if a company in the maritime sector is using the sector-specific approach in the near term, they are also obliged to set a long-term target. So that's, in that case, is compulsory. Great. So if we move to the next slide. Let's jump quickly into the transition plans and MRV. So let's say you have already established your net zero target, and many companies are doing that. So from the 5,690, and this is an outdated, I think I saw yesterday, there were about 6,000 something companies already in the SBTi with approved targets. But this is a note from July. But from those, 3,309 have net zero commitments. And from those 3,309 commitments, around 2,300 companies have already set net zero targets. So many companies are setting their targets, but now they're thinking, okay, how are we going to achieve this, right? So, and if we move to the next slide, Fernanda. So, oh, sorry, I forgot that I had a case study. But basically, I just wanted to show here an example of the TDCnet, a Danish provider of digital infrastructure. And you can see that their target is to become net zero in its operations by 2028 and net zero in its value chain by 2030. And they have indicated that it's possible to reach net zero earlier because they're planning to be 100% renewable energy powered. But the difficulty is actually in the value chain emissions because they have more than 3,500 suppliers worldwide, right? So we will talk more about the challenges in Scope 3 in a minute. But also just to moving forward, there are also a lot of benefits that companies have identified for setting these ambitious net zero targets, like this company saying that they issued a sustainability-linked bond as part of a debt refinancing, and they're also seeing some impacts in the attraction of talent. Next one, please. Now jumping to transition plans. I forgot that I had the case study. So as I was saying, many companies have set these ambitions, but now they need to translate that ambition into action. And for some companies actually in Europe, developing a transition plan is an upcoming legal requirement, right? So for others, it's more an expectation from boards, shareholders, creditors, etc. But for many, it will be a requirement. So that's why also the Global Compact network of Norway has developed this guide that I found really interesting and really comprehensive. I would recommend you to read it. And I think they did this together with EY and Capgemini and an expert group, and it's really inspired on the UK transition task force that has developed also a standard for corporates in the UK. So this guide, defines what is a transition plan. So it's a strategic plan that defines how a company will shift to sustainable practices and activities by balancing social, economic, climate, and nature-related needs. It recommends starting with double materiality assessment, right? Also compulsory for many companies now in Europe. Establish the current situation, set ambitions, and as part of setting those ambitions, setting ambitious targets, emission reduction targets, create an action plan and implement, right? And really, what the guide says is that these steps are not necessarily going to be used in this order, right? It depends also where your company is, and it's an iterative process. So, but it's still very helpful for each of these actions. There are a lot of sub steps that you can use for inspiration for creating your own transition plan. So if we move to the next slide, please. Some of the main objectives, as I was already saying, it sets the framework for how a company will turn strategic ambitions into concrete actions. It also takes into account the specific regional circumstances of Norway and some challenges with, for example, the oil and gas sector, fishing sector, and hydropower. It basically prepares companies with the European sustainability reporting standards, and it also will help you avoid the greenwashing trap, right? Which is explained in the guide as when a company highlights its sustainability achievements only, and they do not talk about also the challenges and the room for improvement. Great. If we move to the next one, please. So I talked already about the steps and about the need to use this guide not in a sequential order, really just use it as you need it. The steps and activities in the guide will likely not be implemented in a chronological order. I think nothing else to add there. Finally, just want to remind us that SBTi is working on an MRV protocol. However, there's current guidance on where to disclose and what to disclose. You can find that information in the corporate net zero standard. But basically, you can disclose using your CDP annual questionnaire, your public reports or the Global Reporting Initiative, anywhere that is public, the SBTi accepts. And just want to emphasize that in that chapter of, or that section of the net zero standard, when where they talk about MRV, they highlight that companies need to disclose not only their greenhouse gas inventory, and of course using the new using the principles of the GHG protocol, but they also should include the target description, target progress, substantial emission variations and changes in targets. And they also added actions towards meeting science-based targets. So that's basically your transition plan as well, right? So SBTi is also encouraging companies to report on these actions. Great. I think we have last section, and I have a lot of content here, so I'm just quickly checking on time. I can skip some of the slides, but maybe if we start with just a quick overview of what the net zero standard major revision will cover, and then we can voice over the rest of it. If there are many questions already, I'm not sure.
That sounds good. We have 3 questions currently in the Q&A. So maybe we also, those of you who attended the near-term session last time, we did cover this a bit. So maybe just put a few words on it, Paula, and then we can get to the questions.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, the net zero standard is under a major revision. The main goals are to align with the latest climate science, address challenges related to Scope 3, and I have some slides on what that revision to Scope 3 could encompass. I don't know if you have seen the Scope 3 discussion paper that the SBTi recently released. Also, they are planning to integrate continuous improvement as in how companies should be reporting their progress and advancing towards their targets. And also they are aiming to improve the structure and enhance the interoperability with other frameworks. Something that is not here, because it was also...
Där som gäller, men jag har en sån och så kan jag stoppa den i datorn. Så att jag har jättesvårt att...
I think we need someone to mute themselves.
Great.
Or maybe one of my colleagues can help.
I thought someone was already super enthusiastic to help.
Yes.
Okay. And something that is not here, but because it was recently announced, is that SBTi will also include in this revision some more guidance about neutralization. So they don't say much about it, but I participated in an event, first discussion organized by SBTi. But one of the things that they're trying to understand is the guidance that they can provide companies on those milestones towards reaching, the neutralization at the end of your long-term target. They are not planning to include guidance on what counts as neutralization, and that's out of scope, but at least on milestones. So we can talk lots about scope. I have many slides on Scope 3. It's a very interesting discussion paper, but I will skip those and I will just only present the timeline. But basically, there will be a consultation draft end of this year. There will be 6 weeks of pilot testing that now SBTi, as part of their procedure for developing standards, they will follow this pilot testing period as well with companies that want to be part of it. There will be a final approval next year. And actually, I said that they was going to be ready for end of next year, but it might be also, beginning of 2026, depending on how it goes. Great. I'll stop there. Maybe we can take on the questions.
Yes, definitely, Paula, and thank you so much for putting a few words on the revision of the net zero standard. And I think the most important thing to just reiterate what you said before, that nothing has changed in the standards yet, and the door that was slightly open when it comes to compensating or offsetting within your own value chain has been closed a little again. At least it's there hasn't been the changes that some people might have interpreted that there were going to be major revisions to the net zero standards, but that's not the way the wind blows currently.
That's correct. There has been no changes. What SBTi released was the evidence that they collected on environmental attribute certificates, which includes
Yes.
commodity certificates and carbon credits. So there has been no change to the requirements or SBTi criteria. So companies still need to work on their decarbonization strategies for scope 3 and their own value chain. So more to see, right? Like that's what also I wanted to explain a little bit more about that scope 3 discussion paper, because it includes a chapter on different scenarios where these environmental attribute certificates could be used and how they could be used in the SBTi framework. So I would really encourage you to read that discussion paper and that specific section if you're interested on that, on what are those scenarios.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I also think it's important to note that the scientific integrity of the initiative is so important. I mean, the scientific integrity is so important to SBTi. So they and you've worked at a SBTi as well, Paula, and you know that they really care about that. So they won't release anything that is not in line with the current science.
That's correct. I mean, you know, I'm still making up my mind of how to interpret what SBTi released as like initial, you know, evidence or in their analysis of that evidence. I'm really looking forward to learning more in the future months. But it seems to me that there is no, as you said, with respect to the integrity, SBTi really did a good job in trying to divide that evidence into different layers, right? Of, you know, whether it's a scientific paper, whether it's more comment paper, etc., and then trying to also understand the results in an objective manner, and trying to also divide, you know, the papers that were really speaking to the goals of the revision versus the ones that were other things, really trying to clean up all that evidence. And it seems that there is no strong evidence that says that like carbon credits could be used as a compensation mechanism, right? Like there are many downsides to them, but and not strong evidence that they can be replaceable for mitigation. But yeah, I invite you to also read the papers, and they're all online. All the evidence that was submitted is all online. And yeah, and also happy to hear from you if you have already explored that guidance.
Thanks, Paula. Yes, I very, very much encourage the participants to go through those papers yet. I haven't gone through them all yet. You could also go through the standard operating procedures. So SBTi has sort of invited stakeholders into how the initiative is being run. It is moving towards being a standard setter. And I think it's evident that more transparency was needed, and that transparency is here now. As you mentioned earlier, Paula, they also have a technical council and a technical advisory group, which you're a part of yourself. So it's all available on the SBTi website.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a comment from Timmy that the scope 3 discussion paper is an interesting read. I totally agree. I highly recommend it. And I don't know how many more questions we have, but I have a few slides on the scope 3 discussion paper, so we could also go back to the slide deck. Oh, I cannot hear you.
Sorry. We do have 3 questions to be diving into. One of them is how does a company handle the transition from the scope 3 targets from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees and 67% to 90% boundary? That's a big question, but thank you, Timmy, for posting that. Any thoughts and the comments, Paula?
Yeah, it's actually part of part of one of the challenges identified in the Scope 3 discussion paper, because basically it's in one of the annexes, and basically it's saying, you know, if you are not covering the entirety of your Scope 3 emissions in your targets in the short term, then it wouldn't be the same reduction rate if you then jump to 90% coverage of your Scope 3 emissions. And I think in that case, it would be lower reduction rate, like around 3% of reductions if you do that jump. So basically what SBTi is trying to do is to also explore options to make an adjustment from the short-term target to the long-term target, to make sure that that ambition over the whole period, it's in line with the 1.5 degrees goal. I actually would like to do the maths because you know, it makes sense what they're saying in the paper, but more to come on that adjustment. They will definitely have to happen in order to ensure that claims are credible, right? So yeah, come on that.
But it's a very difficult question also, because it's suddenly you need to include much more in your boundary. You need to maybe focus on Scope 3 categories that you haven't been focusing on before as a company. So I guess there is no silver bullet.
No, and I think that also what the Scope 3 discussion paper proposes, there's a proposal of how to also do kind of like a stepwise process where you calculate all your Scope 3 emissions, but then you kind of prioritize those categories that are, you know, high impact on climate. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the Scope 3 categories get to be ignored. Basically, you establish other type of actions for those. For example, using beyond value chain mitigation. I know, sorry, that's the last step. But basically, once you have established your target boundary for the most impactful categories, you still have to take action on the rest of the categories, right? So it's kind of, overall, you just need to tackle your Scope 3 emissions, but the question is how you do it and in what order and what you prioritize first. But in the end, the statement of reaching net zero includes all of the emissions, right? So it includes 100% of Scope 3. And so any residual emissions that you have from Scope 3, they still have to be neutralized. So you do take responsibility over everything, but the question is how you do it, in which order, and how do you prioritize the investments that you need in the short term? How do you make sure that you also prioritize those investments that will probably take place in the long term, etc. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I get the question. I don't know if it was more from the target setting perspective or actually how you implement it. But yeah.
In terms of implementation, I think that the question is quite big, but it is interesting. We could use 2 hours talking about that alone, implementation. And you will also get a chance in the breakout rooms to be discussing that with your peers. How do we actually get to net zero? Is it possible? What is needed within and outside of the organization to reach the targets? I think in the interest of time, and sorry for Ina who just raised her hand, I think we will have a break now, and then we will come back to discussing the questions, the pre-submitted questions. Maybe Paula and Fernanda, maybe you could look at the 2 questions in the Q&A and provide a written answer if you have time. And then everybody, let's get back here at the 13 past 2 or 3 if you're in Finland, or any other time zone you're in. 13 past. So let's have a break. Thanks. And so we have no time to waste, since this is a big topic, and so please let's go into the pre-submitted questions and answers.
Thank you. So let's start with your questions. Thank you very much for sending them. They were quite interesting. So some of them were already answered during Paola's presentation, but we will make a little bit of clarification of them. So the first question we received was, should carbon dioxide emissions, biogenic carbon from bioenergy be included in the target boundary for net zero targets or long-term targets? So the answer is yes. So companies using bioenergy must include direct carbon dioxide emissions from biomass combustion, processing, and distribution, as well as the land use emissions and removals associated with these activities with the bioenergy feedstock within their target boundary. Even though these emissions are reported alongside a company's GHG inventory. And in this graph, we can see that in this graphic, we can see that this is such for near-term and long-term targets. So the next question was, when is the updated net zero standard expected to be published? So Paola already said this, so it is expected to be released by the end of 2025 or beginning of 2026. So we are eager for that to be released. Many good information there. The next question was,
And I just want to, sorry, Fernanda, just to interrupt you a bit. Thank you so much for going through these questions. I just want to remind everyone that you will all receive these slide decks, so you will be able to review the answers afterwards. That's also why we will go over them a bit quickly in the interest of time. Also, if you have more time, if you have more questions for Fernanda and Paola, now is the time to post them. As they will sadly leave us and get on with the rest of their mornings at 5:30 the hour. So please post any questions you have now in the Q&A. Thank you, Fernanda.
Yes, of course. Please submit your questions. We're here for you. So yeah, I'm going very quickly, but if you need any clarification, just please feel free to ask. So the next question is, can long-term science-based targets be set without setting net zero targets? They are referring to study material page 21, which are the 4 considerations for net zero science-based targets. So basically, no, the long-term targets are basically just a part of the net zero targets. So net zero targets, as Paola said, contains long-term targets as well as the neutralization part, right? So it's important to understand that you can not only set long-term targets without neutralizing those residual emissions. And companies, is recommended that companies should disclose information such as planned milestones and near-term investments that demonstrate the integrity of commitments to neutralize those unabated emissions, as we were commenting earlier. So the next question that we also received in the chat was, in which case a company should consider selecting the methods of intensity, the intensity methods, whether the economic intensity method or the physical intensity method. So for the physical intensity method, this one uses the company's intensity metrics, such as, for example, tons of carbon dioxide per ton of cement. And these targets, since there are Scope 3 targets, they must be aligned with well below 2 degrees Celsius. It's the same for the economic intensity targets. But the physical intensity targets have specific advantages. For example, while using physical intensity metrics, companies can reflect the GHG performance and efficiency improvements independently of their business growth or decline. And this also, there is the advantage that they may increase comparability of GHG performance against companies, right? So it is sometimes in the interest of companies to do this, right? To show the advantages. And also there are also some disadvantages. For example, this method is not very suitable for companies that generate a diverse product mix because it's difficult to choose just one physical intensity metric, right? It also requires high data requirements. It has high data requirements because the company might not have specific physical intensity metrics, right? And it also might be less credible to stakeholders because absolute emissions can even rise even if intensity decreases, right? And it's important to report this, to report absolute emissions increase to ensure that this is credible for stakeholders. And for the economic intensity method, it also has to be aligned with the well below 2 degrees. However, this one uses economic emissions intensity, such as, for example, tons of carbon dioxide per unit of value added. And this may be used to normalize emissions for sectors with varying products that are difficult to directly compare against one another. So the difficulty of the physical intensity method. For example, we're talking about retail or chemical sectors, no? And it also may provide more flexibility for companies that are prioritizing growth. However, there are specific disadvantages. For example, this method may only be appropriate for sectors with limited fluctuations in product prices over time, where growth in emissions is often tied to the economic growth of the company. And it also may be difficult to track emissions reduction progress by using economic intensity indicators, especially if a company experiences financial losses in certain years, because this can lead to misinterpretations, right? And it is also subject to a number of variables that can lead to apparent changes in the company's emissions intensity that are not specifically linked to its environmental performance. So rather with extrinsic factors such as fluctuation in prices, inflation, etc. So as we said, it is important to report these fluctuations and these external factors so that the company can be clear about these changes and not linking it directly to the GHG performance.
And we did have a question about this before, so thank you so much for covering this, Fernanda. And we also had a question from Ina that you already responded to in writing, Paola, about how to account for growth when setting net zero targets. And that's such an interesting question where we're not going to have time to unpack now, but it very much relates to, for example, these intensity targets that you can actually allow a company to growth. And then if you focused on per unit of value added instead of absolute emissions targets. Yeah. So I think it was a Finnish participant that asked questions about the difference between these two methods. So there you go. This is the answer. Thanks.
Thank you.
Paola?
Yeah, just on the question that I was answering, I mean, it's one of the most frequently asked questions, but also one of the hardest to really answer, right? Like it depends on the company and, what are the specific challenges for the company in that specific sector. But what is interesting is that, all methods in the SBTI, even there are some like this intensity methods that may be a little bit more flexible for companies that are growing, ultimately all of them result in emission reductions, because that's what really we need to achieve globally, right? And as I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, according to the IPCC, there's a way to do this, right? It's there. The technologies are there to get there, but there are many challenges, and one of them is the Scope 3 challenge, and that's what SBTi is trying to resolve for as well, because maybe it's easier to plan that growth for your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but more difficult to plan that growth when it also depends on the suppliers and customers, right? So I think that that's the tricky part, and it's not something that has been already cracked, but I think that SBTi is going on the right direction, my personal opinion.
That is good to know. And we also had a question in the Q&A about grid projection emission, projecting future grids, emissions from future grids, and that's also just such an important. It's really many companies. You are all at the mercy of this global transition to renewable energy sources. But the answer in short, Paula, that you already wrote is yes. Yes, you can, and you should be, as a participant, you should be able to see these written answers in the Q&A section if you're interested.
Thank you. Yeah, so Paula, you wanted to say
There's
something?
only one more question, I think, that was pre-submitted, so maybe we can quickly cover it.
Yeah, perfect. In the interest of time, I will continue. Okay, so the next question is, if a company chooses economic intensity reduction with value added as a key performance indicator, how does a bad financial year influence the required emissions? Yeah, that's what we were speaking about. So basically, the company shall be transparent about it and publicly report these fluctuations during its report. In the value added due to internal or external factors. And in the annual report, companies must provide, the SBTi recommends that these companies provide an analysis of trends or changes over multiple years, since variability of progress is expected, right? And within this analysis, the company should explain how the company situation is having an impact on those targets set. And companies with emissions intensity targets should also report their equivalent absolute emissions values. So that would be more credible. And the economic intensity is, just to add, it's not the most popular method chosen by companies due to these disadvantages. However, as we explained, there are specific advantages that you as a company might find useful, right? And that's why you are choosing this. But it's just not the most popular method. And a final question was how to treat GHG inventory and target exclusions at the neutralization stage. So here, this is a good question. You would think that you will not need to cover those target exclusions. However, the SBTi requires you to also neutralize those excluded emissions from the long-term target boundary, and also from the exclusions from the GHG emissions inventory. So a company cannot claim to have reached net zero until the long-term science-based targets for all scopes is achieved. And the company also has neutralized these residual emissions. So this is imperative. So I don't know if you have any other questions or clarifications. We are happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. It was a great. We didn't get that many pre-submitted questions, but thankfully there was also some good questions throughout this 1.5 hours. We do have 1 minute left if there's any remark or any question. I just want to say thank you for taken us through the net zero guidance in many different steps and things you need to take into account when figuring out whether your company needs to set or is able to set net zero targets. To the participants, as always, you will be able to review the slides afterwards. Yes, we have a question from Anna. Please unmute.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the presentation and really fascinating discussions, particularly pertaining to growth strategies and thinking about targets. One thing that and I should say I'm representing Alight, which is in the solar space, so kind of selling solar electricity. And one thing that we are kind of dealing with right now in terms of these kind of emission intensity factors is figuring out factors that maybe if there's the standard setting on how to kind of pick out that unit, if you will. For example, some of our industry players do it based off of revenue, which for us is actually a bit of a lagging indicator, and we would prefer if it was based off of kind of more related to the time of procurement or when we are kind of delivering the solar electricity. But I was just wondering if you have any kind of insight on the standard setting of that selection of the unit for thinking about intensity.
Thanks for the question, Anna. I don't know if you were maybe referring to, to the specific challenges of, making some claims of some additional renewable electricity in the grid. Is that what you're talking about? Because I know that that's some topic that SBTi is currently also working with the GHG protocol on the review of the Scope 2 guidance. But just want to understand.
No, I appreciate the clarification. I'm talking kind of about this, just going back to the previous slide of the emission intensity, where it's like the total carbon to CO2 equivalent per unit of value added. So I'm asking if there's kind of a very stringent or kind of standard setting with thinking about the unit of value added, or kind of, no.
Okay. Yeah, so basically, the power generation sector cannot use this method. That's why it's important to review also the SBTi criteria. So power generation companies must use the power sector guidance, and that will use the kilowatt hour tons of CO2 per kilowatt hour metric, right? Which makes more sense for power generation companies. But if you're on the side of, purchasing electricity, then you have also some eligible methods like committing to 100% renewable electricity or reducing those emissions on an absolute basis. I would say that it's less common that companies use the value added aspect. And just if your question was about other metrics about value added, SBTi doesn't allow companies to use revenue, actually. They have to use a metric of value added, like gross profit or EBITDA or any other similar one, because indeed, revenue might be too much fluctuation, and value added will be more a more appropriate indicator, because it already takes into account or like discounts all the costs of the company, right? And so it tries to link more to the actual emissions. But yeah, if you're asking about power generation, then companies should use the power generation sector guidance.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you so much. I think that is what we I think that's it for you, Fernanda and Paula. Thank you so much for getting up so early and being with us and taking us through the net zero corporate standards. And now, before we go into breakout rooms, I just want to say thank you and have a good day to both of you. Also, there's a question in the Q&A about will it be compulsory for companies to set SBTs in the coming years? And that is a very good question that is very difficult to answer, but we will have a session in the wrap-up session in November. We will go through the SBTi's influence on EU legislation and influence on CSRD and also CSDDD. So I think the answer would be somewhere in there. If you already need to report on ESRS E1, then it would be a very good idea to set science-based targets. I think that's the short answer to that question. And now, in the interest of time, I will pass the word on to my colleague Thomas, who will introduce us to the breakout rooms and the breakout room questions.
Thank you, Joachim. I just wanted to add on the last point on the requirement to set SBTIs. At least in Norway, the government has an expectation to state-owned companies that they set science-based targets, and they point to the SBTI as the gold standard for that. And we know that several of those state-owned companies, including Telenor and Kongsberg Group, are requiring 2/3 of their value chain companies to set science-based targets as well. So at least in Norway, it's a coming requirement and certainly an expectation. But let's move on to the breakout rooms. I am going to share my screen here quickly. Hope you can see it. Yeah, you can see my screen. I don't hear any screams, so we'll assume that. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so we've gone over this before. We've already assigned you to different groups. You'll be automatically split into them and be brought back before we're done or when we're done. We do ask you to assign roles in the groups. So one who leads the discussion and a timekeeper, just to make sure that everybody gets involved and you get through the questions that we're asking. If you need assistance, please call for us. Those of us from the Global Compact will be in some breakout rooms as well. I'm not sure if we get to cover everyone today, but we'll be available for you. Again, this is the key part of the program, is to be able to engage with your peers on the issues and questions that you have. So we hope you take this opportunity for that. Stay engaged, respect each other. Don't need to say anything more of that, I think. We're going to have 30 minutes in the breakout rooms today, as we usually do. If there are people you don't know in the groups, please take a minute to go around and introduce yourself. We do ask that if there are two of you from the same company, that one of you takes the lead and is the spokesperson for the company, so that everybody gets a chance or every company gets a chance to be involved. So the companies that the questions that we've chosen for today, we'll put those in the chat so you have it as well. The first one is, on a scale from 1 to 10, how prepared is your company to commit to and set net zero targets through the SBTI? And we ask you to explain why. And the second question is, what are some of the biggest industry-specific barriers/risks to reaching net zero targets, and how are you planning on tackling those? Those are the questions that we'll be answering of you today. And like I said, we will bring you out of the rooms. You'll get notified when you have 5 minutes left and then 1 minute left, and you'll be automatically kicked back here. So I think with that, Solveig, we can engage the rooms and you'll be brought into your breakout rooms. I hope you enjoy the discussions.
Sorry.
There we are, I think. You can see my screen and hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. So I hope that was some good discussions. I know there were issues that were raised in the group I was in. That's common to several people, so that's a good thing. And I hope, obviously, throughout this program that we get you some answers to those questions. And like Joachim said earlier, all the questions that have been asked in this session and all the others will be sent to you as well shortly after. So just shortly on next steps. The next upcoming for you guys, this is an optional webinars, but we highly recommend that you participate in them. So these are globally run sector-specific Q&A sessions on flag financial institutions and buildings. So the first one is tomorrow already. And then on the 15th and the 22nd of October, you can sign up you have to sign up using the links that are in the learning plan on the Academy. They will also be in a slide further down in this presentation that we will send to you. So again, recommend that you participate in that if that's relevant for your sector. Also, on the 24th of October, we do have a SBTI practical exercise. That's also globally run, and that we ask that you sign up via the session or the link to the session that's here. And there are also preparatory material that you should go through if you're participating via that link. These are also available on the Academy, as it were. And again, the answers to all your questions, that's my mistakes as near-term SBTs here, but also the net zeros will be added to the Q&A. And as usual, we ask that you answer our feedback survey so that we can improve our offering to you. Yeah, so this is just some pre-read material that's available for you if you want to prepare for the exercise on the October 24th. The top point is the specifics to the session and the link to sign up for the session. And then we added other resources that's relevant for that as well, which you could go through should you choose to. And I think, yeah, so these are the specific times for the Q&A sector-specific sessions. There are on these dates, but there are two times available so that you can choose between those. You do, again, need to register for those different times. Use the links. And these are the dilemma dialogues that we highlighted last time as well. These are briefs that came out this spring, courtesy of the Nordic networks, that are highly relevant for you. So please check those out as well. Do you want to say something shortly about this, Joachim?
Yes, you might recognize this slide from last time, but we just want to reiterate that there will be a new SBTI validation portal, and it will be in place at the end of this month. That also means that the SBTI is currently pausing all new validation bookings until the end of October. So if you can't book in the system, that is the reason why. But also, please bear in mind that companies with commitments expiring between October and December will be given a month-long commitment extension. But it will be a very, very important part of making the communication between the SBTI and companies easier and much more streamlined. So this is this is very good news for everyone, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Joachim. Let's see here if yeah, and further just additional resources that's available for you. Obviously our Academy and links to different SBTI resources and net zero resources for you. You'll be sent this afterwards, so the links will be available to you. If there are any questions before we wrap up, feel free to raise your hand or post them in the chat. I'm currently not able to see the chat, so if anybody wants to shout out and tell me if there are any questions. Doesn't look like it. So I think with that, we're going to wrap up. Again, if you have any questions or any issues, please do reach out to any one of us in the Nordic Network team. We're always happy to help with any issues you might have. And that concludes the CAA session for today. So again, thank you for participating. Thank you for taking active part in the dialogue. All the information and the recording will be shared afterwards. And again, do reach out if there are any issues. So with that, I wish everybody a continued happy day.